About a few years ago, I made a video where I ranked all of the US presidents based off of how well I think they did at their job. Now, about a year later, where I am today, I've kind of realized that that video wasn't the best high quality video that I've made. A lot of the presidents that I covered, I kind of didn't cover very well, and I also didn't know as much about them as I do now. I mean, granted, I still don't know everything about them. I'm not a historian, but I mean, I think I can give this video another shot, and I feel like maybe I can do some presidents justice that I wasn't able to before. We'll be going them in chronological order, and I actually found one that includes Biden, which for some reason all of the other ones did not. So here we go. So George Washington was the first president, and I'm going to put him in basically an honorary S tier. So for those who know stuff about George Washington, his biggest accomplishment is the fact that he set up what the presidency was. Before him, there really was no expectation for the president to have term limits, be democratic, or really have any of the aspects that we would think that the president would act as. Many people, including, we'll see John Adams next, just thought it would basically just be an elected king. But George Washington set it up to be a democratic, humble position. And for that, he is very important in setting up the presidency. And also all of the things he did during the American Revolution to actually get America to win its independence, I think is worthy of S tier. However, I don't think that what he did as president is anything spectacular. So I believe that he's not as good as some of the other presidents on this list, as we'll see later. So John Adams, I'm torn on this guy. I like his policies. As a Federalist, he knew that unifying the United States would be a good idea, and he knew that that the Democratic Republicans were going to, because they ended up getting control, they were going to end up screwing over the country. The only thing is the Alien and Sedition Acts that he did, completely out of pocket. For those who don't know, they basically made it a criminal to criticize the government and then made it really hard to immigrate to America, which are two extremely, I guess, un-American laws, if you look at it from a modern context. So although I liked most of his policies, because of the Alien Sedition Acts, I can't really put him any higher than B tier. Thomas Jefferson. So I'm also going to put Thomas Jefferson in B tier. So he was the first Democratic Republican to be elected president. And just for that, he automatically gets deducted a little bit. So the reason why I don't like the Democratic Republican Party, and I prefer the Federalists, is because the Democratic Republicans were all about things like no tariffs, states' rights, and direct democracy. At that time, direct democracy wasn't the right way to go because it was later in the 1700s, and like the average person was far less educated than the average person is today, so they knew a lot less about politics and policy and how to govern a country. Jefferson, as for the other part about states' rights and no tariffs, all of that would hinder the development of the country because you need tariffs in order to build up an industrial base when you don't have a strong one. And states' rights actively hinder that because it gets rid of a lot of central controls that help the country run smoothly. I'm talking stuff like interstate commerce, a national bank. So for that, Jefferson gets placed lower. The reason why he's placed in B and not, say, C tier is because he went through with the Louisiana Purchase, which I think was one of the greatest decisions in American history, because it doubled the size of the U.S. and eventually got the U.S. to expand all the way to the coast. So for that, he gets B. Good job, but you could have done better. All right, James Madison. I'm going to put him in C tier. Competent man, but got us into a useless war, the War of 1812. And really got nothing to show for it, so there's no reason why he should be ranked any higher than C tier. And then there was also the fact that he was a Democratic Republican, which the issues I've already talked about before. James Monroe, same thing, but I'm going to put him higher than Madison because, yeah, I'm actually going to put Jefferson higher than Adams as well. I'm going to put Monroe higher than Madison because he didn't make a blunder like the War of 1812. He presided over the country when it was mostly unified, and yeah, the Monroe Doctrine wasn't really that important by long stretches, so I'm not giving him a lot of points for that. Later presidents that end up using the Monroe Doctrine well, like Teddy Roosevelt, I will be including, but just because he said a few words that never really impacted U.S. foreign policy for like the next 50 years, I'm not going to give him credit for that. Alright, Quincy Adams. I'm going to put him ahead of his father. The reason I'm going to do that is because this was the guy that tried to set the United States back on the Federalist track, even though he wasn't technically a Federalist. He was a National Republican, because the Federalists at that point were dead. But despite the reasons a lot of people dislike him, because he kind of weaseled his way into the election. I don't really care if you weasel your way into the election. If you have good policies, you're a good president. So for that, I'm going to give Quincy A tier. And his policies that I'm talking about, mostly the Federalist stuff that I imagined, central bank, limiting states' rights, tariffs, all stuff to develop the country. Oh, and I forgot one. It's infrastructure improvements. The Federalists and later the Democratic Republicans and the Whigs were also very into infrastructure in order to link the country and develop commerce. Should I explain the I think I'll just go ahead and explain the American system then. So, American system was the Whigs' idea, and this is a little bit past this time, around the 1840s, 1830s. What the American system was, is it was essentially a three-pronged plan in order to develop the country. Tariffs in order to build up industry. Infrastructure improvements in order to make commerce easier. And a central bank in order to also make commerce easier. Great ideas, and mostly done by Henry Clay, who ran for president a few times, but never actually won the president because of a few other people we'll see later. But yeah, just for supporting these policies, Quincy gets A tier. Alright, next up is Andrew Jackson. This guy sucked. Literally sucked. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people hate this guy. For one, he was an extreme racist, and he actively went against the Supreme Court's orders and prior U.S. treaties in order to remove Native Americans from their lands and deport them to Oklahoma, killing thousands of them along the way in the Trail of Tears. Other reasons why I hate him, he went against a lot of the policies I've described in the American system. So he got rid of the national bank that had been established decades before, and he set up a bunch of useless, we'll call them pet banks, that were run by the states. Extremely inefficient, because when you don't run a bank centrally, it can have a whole bunch of issues. I mean, if you look at American society now, we have our banks centralized and run essentially by the federal government, even though they are private corporations. So this guy, basically just a useless reactionary, didn't accomplish anything worthwhile, and you get F tier. Alright, Martin Van Buren. I mean, he gets the points for not being racist, but he's nowhere. He's not even remarkably better than Andrew Johnson. Martin Van Buren's mostly ranked lower than Johnson because it was under him that the Panic of 1837 happened, which was a massive, or not a massive, but a decent-sized economic crisis that happened. The reason why this happened, however, was not really Martin Van Buren's fault. It was because this guy got rid of the central bank, and so that when inflation and a lot of economic problems happened, the federal government couldn't actually do anything because it had delegated its responsibilities to lesser authorities. So Martin Van Buren was basically stuck watching a crisis unfold. I mean, he could have responded better to it, like by making a new federal bank, but he was mostly a result of the mistakes of his predecessor. Alright, William Henry Harrison. I'm actually going to have to make a new tier that's essentially just unrankable, because this guy died 53 days into office. Oh, whoopsie. Bear with me here. Reagan. But yeah, this guy lived 53 days, completely useless. John Tyler. C or D, C or D. I'm gonna give him C. So, nah. I'm gonna give him D. So, reason why I'm giving John Tyler D, he was William Henry Harrison's vice president, but what he accomplished was essentially nothing, because he was a Whig by name, but not really by policy, which automatically deducts him points. And as a result, his presidency was somewhat useless, and he ended up just conflicting with the Whigs in Congress, and eventually was kicked out of the party because he wasn't Whig enough. With that being said, the one thing he did do right was establishing the precedent that vice presidents take power after the president dies, because while it doesn't seem like a major thing, it is really important, because it ensures that the line of succession to the presidency is safe, and you're just not gonna, and it ensures that you will have a president no matter what, and you won't just like not have a president. So for that, I'll give him some points and keep him out of, I'll make him higher than Martin Van Buren, and I'll keep him in D tier. Alright, James K. Polk. This guy was low-key awesome. Shame he died so early. He's most known for getting the Oregon Territory, which had prior to this been jointly settled by the United States and Great Britain, but he worked out a treaty to get a huge part of the Oregon Territory, and then he also oversaw the U.S. victory in the Mexican-American War. Now, I'm all for American territorial expansion, and I know that some people have criticized the Mexican-American War because it was a war intended to expand slavery, which is true, and I'm not defending that, but it also, in the long run, increased America's overall power by increasing its territory and the amount of people that could settle. So yes, for massive territorial expansion, I'm gonna give Polk an A tier. I'm gonna put him above Quincy. His domestic policy, I don't really know much about, so I can't really say much there. Alright, Zachary Taylor, another unrankable guy because he died only a few months into office. Millard Fillmore, yeah. Kind of similar to John Tyler. There's not really much to say about him other than the fact that he wasn't an amazing president. So yeah, still gonna put him ahead of Van Buren though, but below Tyler because he didn't have the whole precedent thing. All right, Franklin Pierce. Oh boy, the presidents before the Civil War were just so useless because they dragged their feet trying to hold the nation together and ended up making some of the worst decisions possible. To be fair, this guy's wife and kid got impaled and killed on his train ride to Washington, D.C., so he wasn't exactly in the best mood, but then again, you're the president, you have to be a tough guy and make good decisions. So, Franklin Pierce, yeah, low D tier, low D tier. James Buchanan, I'm going to put him in F, behind Jackson. So not only was this guy as useless as Franklin Pierce, but he also did nothing about Southern secession. You don't just let states secede and then throw your hands in the air and be like, not my problem, I'll leave it to the guy who was elected after me, despite there being 6 months after the election before the guy takes office. Oh my god. James Buchanan. I know you didn't like the job, but you still have to actually do it. Alright. Now finally we get a good president. Abraham Lincoln. S tier. Do I even have to explain myself? Held the country together through the Civil War. And then started Reconstruction. Instant S tier. Held the nation together in a time of crisis. What more could you ask for? I mean, there isn't a single aspect of Lincoln's character that you can criticize. Even the fact that he had to suspend a bunch of free speech rights during the war, ultimately justified in the end because the North needed to win the war to end the evil that was slavery. So yeah, this guy gets an S tier, and I mean, I feel like most people here would agree with me. Alright, after a best president comes another shitty president. For this one, it's Andrew Johnson. So this guy's terrible because he completely screwed over Reconstruction. Reason why he screwed over Reconstruction is because he was a Southerner. And despite being Lincoln's vice president, he ended up going pretty much against everything that Lincoln wanted to do, and also the other Republicans in Congress. And he ended up giving land back to the Southern planters instead of redistributing it among the freedmen. And he gave pardons. Basically, he tried as much as he could to disrupt the Republicans' efforts to rebuild the South in a better way than it would be before the war. And as a result of him, the planters retained a lot of their power, and this would enable Jim Crow laws to influence and have a greater strength. So had this guy not been here, the South probably would have been reconstructed better, and we wouldn't have a lot of the social problems that we see in the South as a result of this. So yeah, F tier, even behind Buchanan. Grant. So I'm going to put Grant in B tier. So while he wasn't the best politician, he did oversee Reconstruction and fixed a lot of Johnson's mistakes. By fix Johnson's mistakes, I mostly mean let Congress do what they want because they knew what they were doing. The radical Republicans at that time were doing a good job with Reconstruction, so he just let them do their thing. And yeah, for that he gets B tier. The reason why he is an A tier is because, like I said, he wasn't a very good politician, and he also, his administration was corrupt. So sorry Grant, you were a great general, an okay president, but you could have done better. Alright. Rutherford B. Hayes. Yeah, D tier is fine for Rutherford B. Hayes. Except I'm going to put him at the top of D tier. Because his some of the policy that he did in regards to industrial policy was fine, but his main issue was that he ended Reconstruction. The South, by 1876, when he was elected president, was by no means fixed of the social problems that plagued it, which had led to the Civil War and a bunch of other things. So he decided to make the personal choice of making a deal with the Democratic nominee to give himself the presidency in exchanging for ending Reconstruction. I mean, I can see where he's going for, where if he lets the Democrat get the office, then he might end Reconstruction anyway. But, like, Rutherford B. Hayes, you sacrificed so much potential progress just so that you could become the president. And for that, you get a D tier. Right. James Garfield. I mean, a lot of the Gilded Age presidents that we see are kind of the same. They don't really do a whole lot. They're just really C tier because they weren't significant men, but they weren't bad men like any of these ones in F tier or a few of these guys. They just kind of were there because the main center of Gilded Age politics was the industrialization that was present during that time period. And it was a very business-centric time, which meant that politicians, especially presidents, that were weak-willed and didn't really do a whole lot, didn't have their effects really matter. So, for that reason, James A. Garfield, as well as Chester A. Arthur, Cleveland, and Harrison all get the C tier treatment. Cleveland I'm putting in B tier, just because he had some pro-labor friendly policies during his first term, and he was a bit more significant than these other three. I'm ranking Garfield higher than Arthur and Benjamin Harrison, because he was assassinated, and his death led to the Pendleton Act, which was... It's kind of sad that your greatest accomplishment was the fact that you died and thus an act was passed, but still, the Pendleton Act was one of the most significant, still is one of the most significant acts in U.S. history, because it meritocratized the federal bureaucracy, which means that the positions of power, or the positions within the federal bureaucracy were given by skill and merit and not political appointments, which meant that the government was run more smoothly, and also it wasn't a bit of crony capitalism. This whole issue of meritocracy and crony capitalism in the federal bureaucracy we'll actually see later when I talk about Trump. But for now, Pendleton Act, that's what sets you apart from your other Gilded Age people. Alright. William McKinley. B. Above Cleveland and Grant. So McKinley is often overshadowed by his incredible successor, but the accomplishments that he did were also decently significant. He was the president that won the Mexican-American War, started U.S. imperialism, rode U.S. power on the world stage, and also he was the first president under which the United States was a world power. Now, was that entirely because of his skills? No, but he definitely was a skilled man, and I could say if any of these people were running the country at his time, the country would not be as well off. But he is definitely overshadowed by Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt, I'm going to put ahead of Washington. Lincoln, I'm also putting ahead of Washington because I already just kind of described Washington. Roosevelt gets S tier because of his incredible policies. Not only was he extremely assertive, he recognized that the United States was a powerful nation, and he was able to use that in order to increase U.S. prestige abroad by sailing the large amount of ships over throughout the world to just show Europe that, hey, we're also a great power, treat us with respect, to which Europe was like, this is cool. He also had big stick diplomacy, bullied around a lot of the Latin American nations into submission, which, although may have not been great for relations with Latin America, it ended up forming strong partnerships with Europe, which was really helpful. He also served as a peacemaker during the end of the Russo-Japanese War, where he oversaw the peace conference, and for that he actually won a Nobel Peace Prize. But his biggest accomplishment was the fact that he was the first true progressive president, and the progressives in the 1900s context were the presidents that were looking at the excess business strength of the Gilded Age and trying to rein in the big trusts like Standard Oil or the railroads or steel companies. And his policies in that, using antitrust legislation to bust a lot of monopolistic trusts, really helped with social policy. Or not social policy, really helped with strengthening the nation. But also he was smart enough to realize that there were some trusts that were, because they were monopolies, were able to operate more efficiently, and so he was smart enough to be like, alright, we'll leave those alone. And finally, I know I have a lot to say about Roosevelt, he established the first national parks, an important step in the right direction for conservation. So yeah, good job, Teddy Roosevelt. His successor, Taft, also a good president. I'm going to put him in high B tier because he continued a lot of the policies of Roosevelt, but he wasn't as strong of a personality, which meant that he wasn't as good at foreign policy. He wasn't a big stick man. He was a dollar man. Which basically just means throwing money at people and gaining investments and all that, which is something he did with China. But yeah, no, Taft kept up Roosevelt's policy of breaking trusts. He actually broke more trust than Roosevelt. but two things set him back. One was the fact that he broke trusts that Roosevelt thought were good trusts, the ones that I've explained, that because of the fact that they were able to control all of the resources, they were able to use things more efficiently. Like, I'm not an expert at economics, but there is, it makes sense that there are some industries where if you have one firm that's doing everything, like, for instance, a railroad, as long as that industry is regulated so that its profits aren't exorbitant, it makes more sense to have that railroad centralized control than to, say, have a bunch of competing railroads that build overlapping lines and a bunch of redundancies. So that's why some trusts or some monopolies can be good if they're regulated properly. So yeah, he made one blunder there, and then his other blunder was he was an early advocate of economic conservatism, which sets him back a little bit, especially in the era of the progressives. All right, Wilson. Low A tier. This is going to surprise a lot of people, but I actually do like most, not all, most of the policies that Wilson did. He kept up the progressivism from Roosevelt and Taft, and aside from that, he also got the United States into World War I and tried his hardest to establish peace on that continent through getting, having nations get self-determination, especially with the Arabs, because, a little bit of history for you. Before World War I, the Arabs were either somewhat independent, relying on Ottoman suzerainty, or directly a part of the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman Empire collapsed at the end of World War I, these Arabs were promised a large country by the British, but what ended up happening was the British were like, no, we're instead going to set up a protectorate, and you guys don't really have the skills, or they thought that they didn't have the skills necessary to implement democratic countries and govern themselves, basically. So instead, they drew arbitrary lines on paper, divided the lands of the Arabs into a bunch of different countries, and in doing so, set up the seeds for a lot of the conflicts in the Middle East today. So this guy tried his hardest to prevent that. I mean, he ultimately wasn't successful, but for his efforts in even having some unified states and other states in Eastern Europe and Arabia, for all of that, he gets an A tier. What keeps him out of S tier is the fact that he was a racist. And I feel like most people at this time know that, or most people in my time know that, and I don't really have to explain myself there. Alright, Warren G. Harding. I'm going to put low C tier. So, Warren G. Harding was... So he's... A lot of people would rank him lower because of corruption in his cabinet. But the thing is, the corruption really wasn't his fault. It was his advisors and his cabinet, which he wasn't under direct control of. And he also pursued somewhat decent policies of economic stabilization. Granted, they were, he did go back on the progressives, the accomplishments of the progressives before him. So that's what's keeping him out of the high tiers. But in terms of running the country, he was competent. He knew what he was doing. And the corruption holds him back, which is why he's low C tier. Calvin Coolidge. Very similar president to Harding, minus the corruption, but even more socially conservative. Or not socially conservative, my bad. Economically conservative. Although he did, when he was cutting taxes, he did so, according to a book I read, quote, in a way that was harmful to the rich people. I'm not really sure how you do that. I guess you cut taxes only on poor people. But I mean, he was competent. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't terrible. I'll put him in the middle of C tier. I think right after Madison. Yeah, that looks good. Alright, Hoover. So he was the most, ironically, economically liberal out of the three 1920s Republican presidents. But his problem was that he didn't react at all. Or he reacted, but he didn't react well to the Great Depression. At that point, when the Great Depression struck, he acted slowly, thinking that the businesses would fix themselves as they always did, because that had been just what happened in the 1920s. So when he finally realized that the situation was not going to fix himself and the federal government had to act, that people already hated him and there was really nothing that he could do. His popularity was shot. He tried a few things, but without the support of the public, he couldn't really do anything. So an unlucky man for sure, but also not a great president. I'm going to put him at the top of D tier. FDR, instant S tier. In fact, I would actually say FDR is my favorite president. Reason why I like FDR so much, he was there for 12 years, he got elected 4 times, the people loved him, he had some of the greatest electoral landslides in the history of the United States. And the reason why the people loved him, because he was a great speaker, he knew how to communicate his ideas to the public, and he had great ideas. And those great ideas were the New Deal, which, although a bumpy ride, successfully rebuilt a lot of the American economy as from the Great Depression, and he also established a lot of the security welfare nets. I'm talking Medicare, Social Security, and led a lot of infrastructure projects in basically rebuilding America. This guy contributed so much to the nation that he really deserves to be the best president. And that's not even including the fact that he saw correctly that Nazi Germany was a threat to the entire world and did as much in his power to support the Allies and eventually get the United States into the war and then win it. So for that, I wish you could have lived a little bit longer. Sad that you got to die in office in 1945 before the war ended. Thank you, FDR, for being such a great guy. Alright, and then as VP, Harry Truman, A tier. Not as charismatic as FDR, but had a lot of the same policy ideas. Made the difficult choice of finishing off Japan with the nuclear bombs instead of the invasion, which saved hundreds of thousands of Americans' lives. And then he also continued FDR's policy of New Dealism, so a lot of state control, curbing business interests, and keeping the economy healthy. The reason why he doesn't go in S tier is simply because he wasn't as great of a he just wasn't as great of a speaker as FDR, and as a result lost a lot of the support of the conservative Republicans, and a lot of his policies were unable to be passed because of this. Alright, here we go. Dwight D. Another A-tier president. A lot of the post-war presidents were just some of the best. This guy, most known for his moderate, cautious, but ultimately skilled and effective leadership. He's most known for having the interstate system be developed, which, I mean, I would have preferred public transport, but at the time, because Americans were extremely individualistic, and because owning a car was a big thing in the 1950s, building up the connection and having the interstate system, and most importantly, having it be state-run instead of owned by a company, was a brilliant move. And for that, this guy gets A tier. He also kept the country stable during the 1950s. Like, although the 1950s were boring, sure, and conformity was kind of a bitch at that time, he kept the country stable, which is nice. So for that, Dwight D gets A. Alright, Kennedy. I'm going to put Kennedy in high B tier, because a lot of the things that Kennedy's mostly known for, like social progressivism, happened a lot under his successor, and he also has a few problems with himself. He was extremely well liked, and he, like I said, he had a lot of the social policy that Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president, would eventually become to known. But a huge scar on his reputation was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was absolutely terrible. because it was poorly planned, poorly executed, and ended up solidifying Fidel Castro's control of Cuba. I've actually, now thinking about it, I'm thinking I'm going to put Kennedy in A tier. I think I'm going to put Kennedy in A tier because it was because of him, the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't escalated into a nuclear war. And he had very strong leadership there, talked with Nikita Khrushchev, and made sure that the situation did not dissolve into a nuclear war. So for that, you get A tier. And also, there's the fact that the Bay of Pigs invasion wasn't entirely Kennedy's fault, because it was largely planned on Eisenhower, and Eisenhower left the mostly planned invasion to Kennedy when he took office. I mean, Kennedy is still responsible for going through with it, obviously, but the planning was done under Eisenhower. Alright, Lyndon B. Johnson. I'm going to stick you right with Kennedy, because these two are very similar. Both extraordinarily genius on social policy, but ultimately having military things drag them down a bit. For the social policy, it was Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. In other words, trying to build up U.S. society and escape poverty. So he did this mostly through welfare programs, but also through developing education, which is so amazing. But yeah, Great Society enormously reduced poverty during the time that it was implemented, and had it not been for his escalation of the Vietnam War, the Great Society would have continued going and helping Americans for decades to come. The reason why it didn't was because the war in Vietnam sucked up a lot of the United States' economic resources, and the Great Society, being welfare-based, cost a lot of money, and there just wasn't enough money there to have both of them at the same time. Alright. Richard Nixon. My opinion on this guy has kind of turned a bit. Watergate's a scandal, yes, but and I've kind of said this before with Quincy Adams, I don't really care about how you get the presidency. As long as you do a good job as president, I'll give you credit for it. And for that, I'm going to put Nixon in low B tier. The reason I'm putting Nixon in low B tier is because he successfully got the United States out of Vietnam, and although he escalated the war into Cambodia, the way he did it was primarily through bombing, not sending soldiers there, which meant that overall he was sending less Americans to die. And although he could have worked faster, his conduct of the war in Vietnam was satisfactory and got the United States out of the war in a somewhat timely fashion. On the social front, I forgot about the war on drugs. Never mind, you're going in C tier. Middle C tier. Yeah, the war on drugs. Well, his social policy was mostly divided into two spheres. One, keeping the New Deal, which is why I originally put him in B tier, and keeping welfare and all of that. But also, two, he started the war on drugs. Now, he even admitted himself that the war on drugs would be biased towards persecuting black people. And since then, it has just been an extraordinary scar on American society by sucking up huge amounts of resources and dumping them into the wrong problems. He incorrectly realized that drug addiction was not a problem it just wasn't a problem that you can solve through brute force. The drug issue is complex, but trying to beat it with a hammer is kind of like playing whack-a-mole, and every time you whack-a-mole, you hurt your own citizens. So, yeah. Richard Nixon was a man of many ups and downs, and for that, I'll put him in the middle of the tier list, and see. All right, Gerald Ford, low C tier. Okay, president, didn't really accomplish anything significant. Pardoned Nixon for Watergate. Tried to fix the economy and failed. Pretty standard. Carter, D tier. High D tier. Actually, if I put Carter in D tier, nah. I'll explain why. So, both of these men, Carter and Ford, tried to fix the economic problems of the 1970s, which was stagflation. In other words, the economy is stagnating, but there's also inflation, which is a problem because when the economy is stagnating, you want to increase inflation in order to prompt people to spend more money so that the economy goes up. But when there's already inflation, that'll just send prices to exorbitant levels and people will start getting really mad. But if you try to curb inflation through, let's say, raising interest rates, you just end up hurting the economy, but the economy is already in the toilet. So it's a very hard situation to solve. And both of these men did not know how to solve it. And, yeah. Carter is the worst of the two, though, because he also failed in getting the U.S. hostages out of Iran when it fell to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And then he blamed all of the issues on what he called a social malaise, which just wasn't very smart. But before we move on to Carter, I would like to say, rest in peace, man. You will be missed, because while he wasn't a great president, I mean, he was a pretty terrible president. He was an amazing man, and like the nearly 50 years that he spent after he was the president was dedicated to so many amazing causes. So for that, you get D tier, but also a special place in mine, and I would say all Americans' hearts. Oh boy! Fuck you! Reagan might be... I'm not actually going to put Reagan in F tier. He's going to go in D tier. Because he did one thing right, and that is ending the Cold War. He successfully, through his charisma and through selective remilitarization, was able to force the Soviets into a position that they couldn't maintain, forcing Gorbachev to basically admit defeat in the Cold War because the Soviet economy was weaker, couldn't keep up with an arms race, and he eventually thought that the Cold War was going to end with an American victory. That's the only thing this man did right. Not only did he was an early advocate for social conservatism that would come to bite the United States in the ass in decades to come, he also set a precedent for pro-business politics. I'm going to try to remain calm here and just explain this as logically as I can. Trickle-down economics did not work. His idea was that by bringing tax breaks to the rich, that they would spend more, and that money would trickle down to the middle class and the poor. The thing is, it didn't, because when the rich are taxed less, they're just going to keep their money, and they're going to spend it on luxury goods. And even if that would trickle down to the lower classes, the only jobs that are going to be benefiting from that is jobs that actively support the lifestyle of rich people, which is mostly useless jobs in the luxury and services industries. Besides this, it was because of him that the national debt climbed to extraordinary levels, which is something that continued with presidents after him, and he enormously contributed to raising wealth inequality in the United States. So, for his disaster of a policy that was economic deregulation. Oh, and I also forgot that he also re-regulated a bunch of industries, undoing a lot of the progress on environmentalism and business regulation, which actually this guy, Nixon, was quite supportive. He was very much in support of the EPA. Like I said, this guy is scattered for all policies. You can't pinpoint him down. But yeah, this guy just did so much damage through deregulation and detaxing. I'm really glad this guy died of dementia. It sounds horrible to say it, but like, I'm so glad this guy died. Anyway, George the First. Well, I mean, it would be technically not George the First, but Bush the First. Bush the First. Better than Reagan because he raised the taxes again, because he correctly realized that the economic situation that Reagan gave him was unsustainable, and despite promising that he wouldn't raise taxes, he realized that it was the thing that he needed to do, so he did do that. And he also wasn't as socially conservative as Reagan. I mean, he wasn't a great president. He didn't have any ideas. He mostly kept up Reagan's ideas, but he moderated them, and he wasn't as radically stupid as Reagan was. So for that, he gets middle of C tier, right next to Nixon. Also, he did see the ending of the Cold War and an American victory. I know this guy set it up, or Reagan set it up, but it was under HW that the system actually worked. Alright, Clinton. Low A tier. Or high B. I mean, his economic policy was pretty good. And by that I mean, he was the only president, I think, in the entire era after the 1970s to have a budget surplus. And he did this but the way he did this was not spending money. Like I said, trade-offs. For every good thing that you do, you have to weigh off the things that are bad about it. Economically, he was moderate. He wanted to do more, but he couldn't because the midterms of either 1994 or 1998 put a Republican majority in Congress, and he couldn't do a lot of the policies that he wished. So as a result of that, he had to be more conservative on social and economic policy. I'm going to put him in high B tier because although personally I think he was in support of it, and publicly he was against a lot of gay people's rights. Yeah. Although I think I'm going to give him an honorary A tier anyway, because, like, being the only president to have a budget surplus is kind of an important thing. Like, you must have been doing something right. So, good work, Clinton. Also, for the record, I'm not holding any of his scandals against him, because, like I said, I judge presidents based off of policy. I don't judge them based off of their ability to... I don't judge them off of their personal character if it doesn't affect how they govern, and I don't judge them on how they got into office. Alright. Now we get Bush the Second. Obviously this guy is D tier. I mean, he was kind of like a second Reagan, but worse. He didn't have the charisma of Reagan, and so his foreign policy was non-existent. I mean, I can say that, like, the one thing he did right was pushing through the Patriot Act as a result of 9/11, which enabled the government to better monitor people within it in order to prevent terrorism. But everything else that he did, including economic conservatism, which increased wealth inequality and screwed over the economy, invading random countries for no reason other than the fact that you had a personal vendetta against Saddam Hussein, and just generally being a terrible leader and injuring America. So next we have Obama. Obama, I'm going to put high A tier. He wasn't perfect. He had his issues, but I'm going to put him ahead of Quincy. He was able to rebound the economy after Bush left it in ruins in 2008. And he significantly expanded a lot of rights. And he significantly expanded welfare. Obamacare was not a perfect solution. That's one of the things I agree with Trump about. but it was a good idea, and it should be obviously reformed and modified to make its ideas and execution better rather than just getting rid of it. So, I mean, not perfect, not anywhere it's great, but definitely a... Did I put you ahead of Polk? No, never mind. Sorry. Yeah, these are my top 5 presidents, in case people were wondering, in that order. But yeah, Obama, I would say, so far, the best president that we've had in the 21st century. Alright, Trump, yeah. I mean, I guess I'll start with the positives. In many ways, Trump led to the decline of neoliberalism, which was a flawed philosophy. Basically, neoliberalism was the idea that we should focus on correcting social ills. Or no, sorry, we should focus on social liberalism but economic conservatism. In other words, let the companies do what they want because they're great, and in the meantime, like, give rights to gay people and whatever. The reason why this philosophy was terrible was because it gridlocked the Democrats into being economically moderate, which meant that they weren't able to correct a lot of the problems that were started under Reagan's administration. In the 2010s, there were a lot of people that felt left out because of a lot of the American industrial decline, which had ruined a lot of jobs in the Midwest, which we call the Rust Belt for that prime reason, as well as farmers who felt like, farmers and other poor white Americans who felt like the Democrats were just completely out of line because they were socially conservative. But also the Republicans were out of line because they were just talking about business interests and doing what's good for business rather than doing what was good for them on a personal level. So this guy, for recognizing, like, I'll give him some points for recognizing that there was a huge part of the American electorate that just was dissatisfied with the current political establishment. I just wish that we, instead of getting right-wing populism that was completely diluted by corrupt business interests, that we got something more akin to Bernie Sanders' model with more left-wing economic populism. Because I think that people could have gotten behind Bernie, especially if Bernie talked a lot more about economic ills rather than social ills, which is something he does mostly. But I mean, being a Vermonter, he's going to have very progressive ideas on how to run society. As for the bad things about Trump, he continued Reagan and Bush's policy of economic conservatism and contributed a huge amount into raising the national debt. He stripped a lot of the protections that were done under Obama, and he stacked the Supreme Court with conservative justices that would eventually ruin a lot of the protections done as far back as Kennedy and LBJ, maybe even Eisenhower. He also was a starter of the movement that that politics is essentially a game. Like, I feel like people have talked about Trump ad nauseum and all of his flaws, so I'm not going to talk about 2 of them here. And also, I'm getting tired, and I would like to end the video at some point. But yeah, aside from the few things that he did right, which I mentioned, he did pretty much everything wrong, and his legacy on the Americans is going to be as akin to Andrew Johnson. As for our friend Joseph Biden, I think he's pretty much a middle-of-the-road president. He fixed a lot of Trump's issues that he did with COVID and the economy, and he was somewhat able to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't reduce inflation, but that wasn't the point of it. The point of it was to grow infrastructure and modernize a lot of the U.S.'s stuff. For that, I'm going to put him in high B tier, right next to, I think right above Taft. I mean, his problems with inflation weren't all his fault, but he probably could have dealt with it better. And then there was also the fact that he picked Kamala Harris to be his vice president, which was probably the dumbest thing that he could have done, because Kamala was not exactly a strong pick to be vice president, and certainly not a strong pick to run in the election. The main reason why the Democrats lost in 2024 was because Harris was a weak candidate, which is partially because of her own problems, as well as the fact that because of her race and ethnicity, she could be an enormous punching bag for a lot of the mega rightists who would look at her as a DEI hire and use those things against her, even though it wasn't at all her fault. But still, choosing such a person as vice president, not a great idea. I mean, he could have chosen Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Bernie Sanders, or any other respectable Democrat. Hell, even Hillary Clinton would have been a better choice. But yeah, with that being said, this is my final president's tier list. I'll just take a quick screenshot of it. That way I can keep it around. But yeah. Thank you for watching this video with me. And if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the comments and I'll do my best to respond to them. Thank you.